Rupali, we can start.
Okay, okay. So welcome everyone to the last session of the third day. We've had a rich set of discussions so far. And also I think, again, what is interesting in this last panel is that it brings together many of the thematics that we've spoken of before. But just to begin, I just want to kind of, again, introduce the panelists for those who have just joined in. We have with us Kush Patel from the architecture, who teaches architecture and humanities at Avni Institute of Design, Sarovar Zaidi from the Jindal School of Art and Architecture, and Prasad Khanolkar from IIT Guwahati. And I'm Rupali Gupte. I teach at the School of Environment and Architecture. So this panel is called Selfing in the City, and in some ways brings together many of the discussions that we've sort of, opened up so far, the questions around the home and its expanded definitions. How do we kind of, rethink or, open up the definitions of the home itself? Questions around the body, the idea that bodies are sort of marked with all kinds of identities. Their bodies are gendered. They are, in some ways, sort of located in a kind of larger uh, uh, world of sort of making and sort of thinking. So and then you also have the idea that in some ways that spaces are kind of constructed, right? Like, so for example, when Prasad spoke about this idea in the last session, that the idea that bodies are fluid, that they kind of flow and they are not sort of contained in some ways. And so in some ways, this discussion is something that we continue here as well. That how are these constructions happening, and what are the ways in which they're constructed, and then of course Sarovar's question that she's been sort of over and over coming back with this idea that spaces are also constructed through materialities, right, through material practices. And I think that is again another aspect that we will see here, the construction of spaces through material practices. And so let's start with the first session, and then we'll come back to some of these ideas that we've been sort of discussing so far. So this panel, the first session on the panel is Priyanshi Bagadia, Intimacy and Home. And in some ways, Priyanshi is also asking some of the questions around, how do you actually draw these intimacies? What does it mean to kind of document intimacies? How do you draw them? What are the frames through which you kind of discuss this idea of thinking of space? There is Gargi Chauhan, who talks about the idea of selfing the city, practices of single women in claiming spaces. And in some ways, the sense of world making, how do kind of women make their own spaces in cities? How do they self? How do they create their own worlds? And then there is Forum Shah, who works with the idea, her thesis is titled Women's Claims, Stories of Domesticities. And again, it's this idea of what does it mean to kind of claim space, or how do spaces change their definitions through the idea of agency. So I think with that, we'll let Priyanshi start her presentation, and then let's come back and see if these also connect to some of the ideas that we've been discussing before.
Yeah. Thank you, Rupali. Hello all, I'm Priyanshi and my thesis topic is Intimacy and Home. I have experience living in a chawl, and right from my childhood, I've noticed that most of the activities are carried out in the corridor, and it is much more than just a circulation space. But one thing which I noticed since I was a child was that there was a lack of privacy. The neighbors used to peek inside my house through the window while loitering around in the corridor, which was not at all comfortable, as I felt the sense of a continuous gaze. I personally didn't have my own space where I could work and sit freely and comfortably because of the crunched space in a chawl. So even though there is a community that gets supported through the chawl, there is always gendering that is experienced through the gaze. The thesis aims at understanding the spaces in a chawl and how the spaces can be made comfortable by decreasing gaze and creating intimate spaces. The operative concepts are private and public spaces, gaze, gender, and intimacy. So, as Ali Madanipur in his book Public and Private Spaces of the City argues that society divides its spaces into public and private spheres, and the division controls the movement from one place to another and access to places and activities. There are private spaces which every individual carries with them, which in turn creates a portable territory around it. There's a constant gaze of people around us through which we modify our behavior and act accordingly. In chawls, women behave according to the space they are in as they feel the constant gaze of people and men around them. Michael Foucault makes clear that the gaze is connected to power and surveillance. The person who gazes is empowered over the person who is the object of the gaze. As women feel the gaze of the people around, they create private or intimate spaces in the chawl. Ioanni Plasma says, we have private and social personalities, and home is the realm of the former. Home is the place where we hide our secrets and express our private shells. There are ways of life in which home has become a public showcase, and the public gaze penetrates the secrecy of home. Gaston Bachelard, in Poetics of Space, points out the experience of home. Indeed, in our houses, we have nooks and corners, nests, shelves in which we like to curl up comfortably, and also hide our secrets in wardrobes, chests, drawers where no one can see it. Backlard in his argument says that the house is a nest for dreaming, a shelter for imagining. On the contrary, Susan Pitt in her film Asparagus shows up a distinctive passionate hushed vacuum of sexual and artistic metaphor followed by a mysterious woman on a journey from intimate toilet to a longing gaze out her curtained window to a hallucinatory garden of totemic flora. She shows how women dream of each space and make an intimate space inside her home as well as outside as defines her secret spaces. So through these arguments and concepts, I led to the research question for my field study. How does the space of a chawl really shape the community as well as the gaze? How do intimacies and privacies get formed in the space of the chawl? For the purpose of the study, I looked at three different types of chawl in Borivali and interviewed 5 people from each chawl, which included men, women, and children. Out of all the 15 cases and stories, I'm drawing 10 patterns as there are overlaps in patterns in each of the chawls. The drawing method for my field study is through a series of frames where each set of frames shows intimate stories and the spaces formed by each person. The drawing strategy is to tighten the frames as that's when one sees the idea of spaces that gets claimed. It is not a spread out, but there is the kind of intimacy which allows or requires the closing in of the frames. Idea of closing rather than seeing it as a scene, closing in tightened frames around so that one focuses on various claims that are made, claims of spaces and strategies through that by creating both a world in mind and also physical space that one claims. When spaces are so intensely shared, people try to create intimate moments. And the drawing below shows the way in which they do it, and these are the patterns which are anchored around certain spaces in the chawl. I was so uncomfortable all the time of being watched, of having to hide myself all the time. Here, the vestibule spaces are converted into personal spaces. The vestibule space in a chawl is occupied at times in the day and at night when women are not allowed to use the other space in the house or when they are forbidden from using other spaces. Also, they feel uncomfortable all the time of being watched. So sometimes she uses the toilet passage area and the toilet as their own private space. This becomes a part of her to relax and work comfortably without being watched by someone when men and neighbors are around in the day. I put up I used to close the doors and use the kitchen as my bedroom and study room. Here the kitchen is used as a bedroom and a study room. The kitchen is used as a bedroom in chawls by women through the day and night, when other men occupy the living room, so they feel uncomfortable as they feel the constant gaze. The kitchen space makes her feel more comfortable as she works and spends a private time in the kitchen, and she feels safe behind the walls where no one can see her. I put up my curtains and make my own private temporary space. Here, the nooks and corner spaces of the chawls are inhabited through the day by people, and the rest of the space is occupied or not available. Every corner in a house, every angle in a room, every secluded space in which we like to hide or withdraw into ourselves when we feel the gaze of people around or when the space is not available. The chests, drawers, and cupboards. Here, the girl occupies the corner of the living room in the day and at night by putting up a curtain to separate herself from people around. There, she opens up a chest, drawers, and cupboards where she keeps or hides all her secrets. A wardrobe's inner space is also an intimate space that is not just open to anyone. I was trying to adjust between the space of the kitchen and toilet. The in-between spaces. The in-between spaces of the kitchen and toilet is used as a hiding space where she rests and makes her own world in such a small space, where she rests and works through the day and night. As there are no walls which separate the living room and the kitchen, because of the absence of space and gazing of the neighbors through the day, she occupies the niche of her home as her own private space. Loft space was my escape space. I create my own space above where no one can see me. Nestling spaces. The attic above the kitchen platform and the living room is used as a space for him or her to study and rest through the day and night when there are guests or neighbors around. The attic in a chawl acts as both storage space and a space to rest and work. The attic space acts as a nestling space, a good warm home where you can have your own personal space and there are no people around. Defiance, the terrace was my escape space. Defiance are secret spaces. Terrace is a kind of escape space when the other spaces are occupied through the day. Here she escapes from her home as there is a constant gaze of the neighbors and people as she lives in a joint family. There's the absence of space, so she uses the terrace space as a space of escape. Mid landing of the terrace is used as a private space where she rests and works in silence. Inside outside spaces. My favorite pastime place where no one can see me and I can be on my own. Courtyard space was our pastime space where we were away from responsibilities. We had our own pastime in the corridor when the men were not around. The corridors and the courtyards of the chawl are used in the day by women to sit and gossip. A chawl with a courtyard is a space where everyone gathers and spends their time together. It is usually used in the day when the men are not around. As there is no one around, they comfortably use that space to relax and have their own intimate space. Here, the woman occupies the corridor and courtyard space as her own space, where she feels comfortable and makes her home outside by doing various activities. So, to conclude, the aim of the study was to understand the configuration of spaces in a chawl and how people modify and occupy them in various ways to claim their own private or intimate spaces. Because of the constant gaze, which makes them feel uncomfortable, and also as a means of escape from this gaze. Based on the fieldwork and its analysis and the research, the major finding is that one appropriates and claims these private spaces based on their comfort and zone and aspiration. It is usually tied to people's lives and emerges from their daily routines, amount of space they occupy, and from one's desire and aspirations. These aspects result in a space where one imagines his or her house as an object and one where the idea of intimacy and home is thought of. These are, in a way, the leftover spaces of the chawl, the vestibule space used as a personal space, the corners, the garrets, nestling spaces, corridors, courtyards, and the in between spaces where intimate walls are created. These are the intimate spaces around which the personal lives of its inhabitants are imagined and built. These types of leftover spaces of the chawl are then inhabited, occupied, and claimed. The objects, drawers, movable furniture, curtains are more of soft things and not just architectural elements like walls, windows, doors, which are mobilized to kind of personalize or make space intimate for women. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Priyanshi, for those very intimate drawings. Can I invite Gargi to start her presentation?
Yeah. Um, Hello, my name is Karti Chauhan, and my topic is selfing in the city. A lot of women are taught that their home is not their own, it either belongs to their parents, her brother, or her husband. This encapsulates a basic feeling of homelessness in them. For most women, their identity and future is already assumed by the society. Most of these ideologies that are imposed are generated due to social norms set by their relatives, neighbors, and ancestors. Nowadays, however, women not only choose to lead their life on their own terms and circumstances, they are not really afraid to live alone and take obligations to reinvent themselves to run away from their already assumed identities. My research highly emphasizes the significance for women arriving from the outside, as it is important for them to find a space in the city to make it habitable both physically as well as metaphorically, through means of contest and claims. The aim of this thesis is to explore ways of selfing amongst women to experience independence, equality, and liberty. For my fieldwork, I interviewed a few women in form of casual conversation to document their experiences of living alone in a city. I took fragments of their life and wrote stories which eventually helped me to expose their lives. The aim of the stories is to understand their context, spatial movements, and their aspirations. In these stories, I have tried to bring together the most significant aspect of the intersecting issues of gender and space. I will be reading a few stories that I have collected. The first story is of Rishali Mishra, who is a creative strategist currently living in Mumbai. Rishali's roots are in Uttar Pradesh, but she spent most of her childhood in Goa. She lived there in an old Portuguese house with a big lawn and a front porch. She grew up playing football, climbing trees, and fishing with her friends. Her circle mostly involved more guys and fewer girls. Dresses were scarce in her cupboard as she liked wearing pants and playing football in the mud. She was never questioned for her dressing for herself, being a tomboy, playing sports with guys on the field. In Goa, she never witnessed a gender discrimination or patriarchy or any sort of stereotypes which was forced on women. She went to a naval co-ed school which had a gender neutral environment. Girls and boys together practiced on the field. Her friend circle involved more guys and fewer girls, and they together participated as team in inter-school competition. As her father retired, they had to move back to Varanasi, which brought a massive change in her lifestyle and culture. Moving to a new city, which was a little conservative than the city she grew up in, she felt that here her identity was not valued enough. People were quick to assign her names like weirdo. She was often questioned for why isn't she girly enough. She was bullied for breaking stigma related to gender. She being friendly with a lot of guys called out for a lot of unwanted attention and created a ruckus. This really hit her identity and she sort of started losing her confidence. Her family was also worried about all the ruckus and chatters in the neighborhood. So they became protective about her and started questioning her even with every move she took. When she had gone out to take to a grocery store where she met a classmate of hers, they just greeted each other and left. When she reached home, she was uh, surprised to know that the news of her little conversation at the grocery store had reached her mother even before she could reach home. She started feeling as if she had all the eyes on her all the time. She then started spending most of her time with her friends who went to the same tuition as her. They played with football on her terrace freely without anyone's obligation. All of this was too excruciating for her, so to maintain her identity, she thought moving to a bigger metropolitan city was the only way she could experience liberty. After finishing her school, she got admission in Mumbai for a diploma in animation and VFX. She was finally able to escape from the feeling of being watched when she moved to Mumbai, as this was a more open-minded city than the city she previously lived in. She again experienced a cultural shift as Mumbai was a little more liberal than the previous city. She stayed here with a elder brother who was a music director. So he spent very little time at home. Even during the weekends, they hardly saw each other. During a recession, she had lost her job, so she believed that once she had started earning, she cannot stop. So she joined a call center for 8 months in UK, processed for and had rotating shifts. Company provided a car for all the traveling after 11 p.m. and also they were escorted by the guards until they reached home. Everything was going fine until her aunt moved in with them. She started scrutinizing her. Rishali had a habit of writing a diary which she used to hide between her clothes in her cupboard. Her brother's girlfriend once snooped into her diary and chatted about it with her aunt. She had mentioned about her crush, whom she barely knew. They made a huge deal out of it, so she stopped keeping a diary and threw away all her old journals. She felt betrayed. She heard a lot of rumors reaching her parents. The most economical thing she did as a student was to share a auto rickshaw with a guy who lived in the same neighborhood. After her brother got married, she thought of giving them their space and moved to a 2 BHK apartment with two of her friends who were already living in Mumbai. They all worked in an entertainment field for 11 to 12 hours every day and sometimes more than that. Their profession involved a lot of late night shifts and not fixed schedules, which used to bother the neighbors. Since they had drinks and ashtrays in their apartment, every time the landlord came to collect his check, they had to make sure everything was hidden. The whole idea of sitting and plotting a cover to fit into the society according to their definition of women was too daunting. Even while living with her relatives, with every step she took, she had to prove that she wasn't doing anything wrong. All these houses that she lived in was did not seem like home. They were like temporary homes to her, which felt like stations. According to Vrushali, the closest she'll feel at home is when she buys her own house and is able to live her life without other people's interferences. The set of words that you see on the screen got highlighted in the story, which helped me articulate the spatial moves and contests of Trishali in the process of selfing the city. Moving out of a small conservative city to a metropolitan city helped her to gain independence as well as liberty to some extent, but the spatial claims were made through means of adjustments. The next story that I will be reading is of Kavita Tambe, who is a content writer currently living in Bangalore. Kavita lived with her parents until her graduation in Mumbai. She was also preparing for her MBA during her graduation. She didn't intend to move to another city as such, but in her final years of graduation, she was bedridden for 2 months due to a fracture. In those 2 months, she felt a little disoriented and restless. So she hastily took a decision to move to a different city post graduation to escape from the monotony. She had friends who had already moved to Bangalore, so she thought considered that city as she would be going away from home for the first time. So she thought it would be better if she can be around people she already knew. She had planned to live in a college hostel. So she first went to see the college campus. Kavita wasn't really happy with the aura of that space. The rooms were small with two single beds. There was no space to move around freely in those rooms. Every opening in the entire building was enclosed by a mesh which made her feel trapped. She couldn't imagine living in such a confined space, so she began looking for a PG house. She lived here with her friends who were already living in Bangalore until she moved into a 2 BHK bungalow as a PG with sharing bedrooms, with a communal hall and a kitchen and a small puja room. There were two rooms in this house, one with triple sharing as it was big, and the other was double sharing with two beds on the corner. She got the smaller room because she didn't want to share a room with other two girls. Kavita liked to have her own space and didn't really like the idea of sharing a room. She was okay with people being in the adjacent room but not in the same room as her while working or reading her books. Living as a PG here was no different from staying in a hostel. There were some restrictions and rules to follow, and Kavita didn't like it either because she never really dealt with any kind of restrictions even when she was living with her family. Uh, the tenants were it was a G plus 2 story bungalow with a terrace. She lived here. She moved to a different house which was a few kilometers away from her workspace. She lived here alone for 10 to 15 days as it was recently put on sale. Later on, two other women came to live in that house. Kavita used to spend most of her time alone on the terrace as no one else would come there. Other girls just come there to dry her clothes. The landlord of this family stayed on the ground floor in the same house as the dinner was cooked and served in the courtyard. In the courtyard, tables and chairs were set up for the people to sit and have their dinner together. Kavita started work after MBA and decided to rent an apartment with her friends. She found a 3 BHK house a few kilometers away from her current workspace. It was a massive bungalow with two terraces, one on first floor and one on the top floor. The house had a view over the lake. The neighborhood was quite pleasant. She often went out for walks to explore her neighborhood. She preferred walking instead of using public transport to remember routes in and around the area. She also kept records of local shops and hostel timings to visit before it shuts. In this story, the interviewee tends to occupy spaces that allow her to hide or escape quickly. She always tries to find a space that allows her to detach from her public identity. When living with roommates, she tried occupying spaces which were least accessed by her roommates, and she would feel like when she would feel like socializing, she would tend to move to the common or the shared spaces. The next step taken by Kashmira towards selfing was by wandering in the city and mentally mapping it to make it resourceful in order to make the city self-sufficient. I collected three more stories, similar three stories, and marked the highlighted words which were mostly recurring. The readings from the stories that I've collected are, and the most recurring elements in the process of selfing that I could identify was one of which is the value of being independent and development of identity, wanting to move to a bigger city away from their parental home, commuting on foot in order to explore and familiarize the neighborhood, space that are qualified to contract and expand to allow them to temporarily detach from their public characters were associated with the most. Their social group consists of people from work, college, and solidarity, and so the solidarity was mostly formed in the situational spaces. The personal and emotional responses of selfing led to interstitial spaces such as attic, terraces, porch, windows, and balconies, which they occupy when they felt like spending time with themselves and detached from their public characters. Walking in the new city became a form of introduction and appropriation. Mental maps of places that were observed carefully helped them to make the neighborhood more resourceful. Larger operational spaces were preferred to have a sense of freedom. Solidarity was the key to the process of surviving in an alien city, which was achieved in the threshold and other shared spaces such as corridors, courtyard, communal rooms, etc. In their temporary homes, they adapted and personalized the spaces as per the surrounding, but they never felt like home. There is a desire to have a property of their own to get away with the feeling of homelessness. So the conclusion is that women's body are only thought of mostly in places where socially constructed roles need special care, such as bathroom, public toilets, and changing rooms. Apart from these areas, relatively few spaces exist where the gender is taken into consideration when planning a residential, public, or a semi-public spaces. It is concluded from the fieldwork that the threshold, interstitial, and walkthrough spaces that allow them to make association, hide, or escape quickly play a key role for an outsider woman to find a space in the city to make it habitable, both physically as well as mentally. They inhabit these spaces through means of adjustments and compromises. When planning an urban infrastructure that provides for the migrants, the threshold, interstitial, and walkability should be designed as such that it together creates a gender supportive environment which will eventually make living independently more convenient. Yeah, I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Gargi. Forum, do you want to come and present?
Yeah, yeah. Gargi, can you stop?
Yeah.
Gargi, I think your screen is still on. Gargi, you'll have to stop presenting. Yeah.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Hi everyone, I'm Forum and today I'll be presenting my thesis titled Women's Claims, Stories of Domesticities. How do women occupy domestic spaces? How does architecture define domesticity? And how does gender figure in this discourse and practice? My concerns and interest with this arise from observing my mother and sister from childhood predate at home. While all of us shared our one-bedroom apartment, our behaviors and patterns of occupying space in the house differed. This difference was observed in various situations, like the presence and absence of my father, finding friendships with the neighbors, wanting our own personal space in the house. Hence, drawing from this, I understand that gender and space mutually construct each other. The thesis looks at the domestic households across various typologies of houses and opens up possibilities for new interpretations. It also explores ways in which women transgress and claim space in domesticities. Thus, the research question that I arrived at is how does gendering shape the spatiality and practice of domestic spaces? Hence, how do domesticities work out through gendering? Unfolding gendering and domesticity. What does it mean for a space to be gendered? Doreen Massey, in Space, Place and Gender, describes this one particular incident from her life. She said, "This was a space that clearly let me know something and something ignominious about what high culture thought was my place in the society. The effect on me being in that space was quite different from the effect it had on my male friends. Uh, from this, I went on to define what gendering truly means. When a space is occupied by a predominant gender category and which is excluding or uncomfortable for the other, it becomes a gendered space. But even though the theoretical framework hints at the lives of the women around the ideas of lack and discrimination, I try to explore ways in which women subvert power dynamics in relationships and constitute space of resistance at various scales. For this, Nida Kirmani, Nida Kirmani, in an article, "Can Fun Be Feminist?" documents the various ways in which women and girls express and experience enjoyment in their everyday lives. It also suggests that while at times neighborhood do become fearful spaces, they are also places of comfort, familiarity, and fun. Um, to investigate this at the scale of the house through the fieldwork, I interviewed 20 women from different homes of chawl, row house, bungalow, and apartments, and inhabited by different kinds of households. The research objective was to of how women uh, compile stories of how women negotiate and claim space in homes. The interviews were conducted in the form of casual conversations by developing friendships with the women and were conducted via phone calls or video calls. Moving on to the field work, the drawing method that is used. The drawing type that is used is that of a narrative graphic type using folds and fragments as a tool. The aim was to draw the home as occupied, claimed, and perceived by the women in their everyday life. This form of drawing allows for greater range of simultaneous impressions, collapsing and unfolding multiple spaces together into one. The fragmented way of drawing thus becomes significant since it becomes synonymous with the possibility that women create their own spaces uh, through the series of distributed scales of claims throughout their daily routines. Through the use of sudden breaks or gutters, dialectical narratives like juxtaposition of an apartment type house beside the row house type, and the use of shifting perspectives effectively represents the home as occupied by the women. I write 10 semi fictional stories and findings from the patterns that have emerged from the interviews. I will narrate 2 of the 10 stories, followed by the readings for the others. In between cooking lessons, it was morning when Aparna woke up. As the drowsiness cleared, she realized her husband wouldn't be home for the weekend. The realization brought with it the gift of time. Well aware of the fact that cooking for her daughter and herself wouldn't be too time consuming, she had few relaxed moments to perch comfortably atop the kitchen platform amidst the chores. Looking out the window while vegetables simmered uh, before her was a favorite part of cooking. Usually caught in the hustle bustle of every day, she'd forgotten the joy of listening to the birds brought her. Despite knowing that her moments of respite and rest would hinder her pace of work, she felt comfortable stretching her legs and sitting in her own space. Smita found a new friend in her brother in law's new wife, Leela. The two women, now sisters in law, would aid each other in the kitchen and prepare all meals together. Smita, who used to find cooking tedious, now had a companion to help her. They found the kitchen soon became a space conducive to make bonds. Day after day, the two women shared conversations and secrets over rotis. It became a haven for their friendship, a place they'd occupy for activities beyond cooking, like painting each other's toenails atop the kitchen platform. It was post lunch when everyone else in the house was occupied with work that she would find time to watch television. The L shaped sofa offered an almost burrow like angular corner spot of the floor, which was her preferred spot. She disliked sitting on the sofa, whose smaller width made it difficult to spread her legs out in the desired manner. This cornered expanse of floor was her favorite space, and no one else could occupy it in the house. Body in space. As opposed to how furniture in the house is intended to be used, through the interviews, the claiming of furniture in a different manner was observed. The platform in the kitchen was used for sitting in leisure and performing activities that it was not intended to. Even though there was a sofa in the living room, women felt rather comfortable sitting on the floor. Uh, Here, the body postures and the unintended ways in the use of furniture occupied by them constitute claiming of resistance spaces by the women. Behind the curtain. Rachita came to Mumbai to pursue her studies, where she and her friend Shraddha share a one-room apartment near their college. It was only a week before Rachita's final exams, and she needed utmost silence and privacy to do her work, whereas Shraddha wanted to party with her friends since her exams had just gotten over. Usually, she didn't have any problems with it, but this time it was critical. To overcome this and have their own private space in the house, they developed a hack to put up a curtain after the living room. Since the kitchen didn't have any doors, beyond the curtains was the place where Rachita felt the most comfortable. She would listen to the music of her choice, change clothes without being watched by her friend, and even work in silence. Sometimes she even hid her favorite snacks in drawers behind the curtains or way inside beyond Shraddha's reach. Both of them eventually understood each other, and these elements became important negotiations that helped them keep their friendship intact. Secret and hiding spaces. When spaces are shared by women in a rented apartment, the use of elements like top and bottoms of the drawers, shelves to hide their intimate objects, and sometimes even themselves in the wardrobes. These objects become smaller ways to claim space and are often not accessible to anyone else at home. The use of curtains as an element to create their own space in the shared space becomes the personal space to perform intimate activities. Threshold, and now I'll be looking at the findings from the other stories. Threshold and porous spaces. In apartment type buildings, the corridors in the flat, which form the transition spaces, usually get appropriated by the women to perform different activities. Here in the afternoon, when men of the house leave for work, all the homes of the floor merge to become one single house. The idea of the door suddenly vanishes and they are all open now. The corridor is either appropriated by a home to make it a part of its own or sometimes just becomes a gathering place. In this case, while apartments are designed for spatial segregation and promotion of private life, the transgressions by the women force it to behave like the common corridor in the chawl typology. Nestling spaces. The bed is a small part of the space but is used by the women at various hours of the day. The one side of the bed, which forms a small space within a large space, is the form of a claim in the house. Women sought to reserve that spot for themselves, and none other could utilize it. These aim towards minimal and subtle ways in which they tried to claim space. Peripheral or frontier space, the door of the house, compound wall, and the gate and elevators among the other elements that facilitate are the elements that facilitate acts of resistance. The spatiality of the home would change in the presence of elders, and the restrictions to not wear certain kinds of clothes or be outside the house after a specific time factored in, where there was a power relationship and surveillance in the house. Women change into different clothing in the elevator on the way outside. The elevator thus forms the space to perform acts of resistance and is appropriated to something completely different. The low height of the compound wall becomes an edge to perform activities like climbing over it in cases when they are unable to enter through the main gate that is locked. The corridor, lobby, courtyards, and verandas, which form the shared spaces between the houses, are often turned into places to form friendships with the other women. The staircase in the apartment and the chawls becomes an area of gathering and chit-chat. They use the space to find enjoyment. In between and outside spaces, the shared terrace between the two apartments, the veranda, and the entrance flint steps, which form the in-between spaces, become places of leisure. Activities like yoga, meditation, and drying of achar and gardening on the terrace act as breathers from their traditional duties and chores in the house. Hiding spaces. The WC in the bathroom is appropriated by the women to perform various acts of resistance and defiance. Smoking near the toilet window, climbing on top of it, and sometimes even reading books and newspapers inside, they tend to create small hiding spaces for themselves in a larger space. In cases of cramped space in the chawl, as well as a large bungalows, the women find comfort in this small world for themselves and often tend to spend hours within. The scale of the house here becomes irrelevant, and what overpowers is the claiming of space. When men and their friends would meet in the house, women would often move to a different room or the corridor. They would spend their time together and often sit on the staircase. While there was a significant relationship between the inside and the outside, it was not only because of the lesser space, but because of the transgression women make to allow the outside spaces to become a part of their homes at times. To conclude, even though the study was carried out by interviewing women from 4 different typologies of houses, within the chawl, row house, apartment type, and bungalows, the patterns mentioned above remain similar in most cases. Claiming of space by transgressions and subversions of power by the women remain constant. Through the interviews and the fieldwork, it is revealed that the relationship of the body in space where furniture and objects are occupied in ways not intended for them, threshold spaces where gendered life starts to get lived, and the interstitial spaces that act like shared spaces and get occupied by the women, which create an entirely different idea of a fluid or a porous space. The idea of spatial continuum, where the homes of the people in the day lend themselves to unfolding and imagining it to become one big home, which generates spaces of conviviality. On one hand, there is an experience of enjoyment in the collective. On the other hand, in order to create personal spaces within the shared, the use of elements like drawers, wardrobes, curtains, and elevators as hiding spaces to perform acts of resistance, occupation of a nestling space, that is a small space within a large space, like bathrooms and bedrooms and beds, are used to create intimate spaces for the women for themselves. Thus, while gendering in domestic spaces is observed, women tend to claim space through subtle, minute transgressions and subvert power structures in the household. Thank you.
Thanks, all three of you. Can we have our discussions? Where's Prasad? Prasad. So yeah, thanks to the three of you for this very detailed presentation and beautiful drawings. I think just to kind of, I'll open up to the discussions, but just to kind of maybe summarize a little bit, Priyanshi in some ways opens up for us, the taxonomies of spaces of the home that women create in the act of, culling out the space of intimacy for themselves. And she takes us through that taxonomy, but in some ways also in that taxonomy shows us this kind of soft materiality through which women construct these spaces, as opposed to the hard sort of edges and sort of sharp boundaries of spaces. There's a kind of softness in the way these kind of spaces are created. Gargi takes us through a detailed kind of ethnographic account of contestations and aspirations of women as they move to new cities and construct their own spaces. Forum, starts off with what Priyanshi is kind of doing, in some ways also kind of speaking of agencies in which women create personal spaces, but she also moves on to speak about the malleability of architecture, standard architecture, whether it's the apartment or whether it's standard furniture, in that kind of act of transgression, and how that is kind of used very differently. So whether it is the kind of standard segregated apartment, which is, when the doors open, sort of become malleable and becomes one large porous space and one large house, or whether the kind of standard furniture is used very differently, where women are kind of through their own bodies perching or, using corners very differently. And so she kind of tells us about, this act of transgression and the kind of rethinking of standard architecture through these. So, but there are probably many more dimensions. So would like the discussants to come in here and open out some of those. So yeah, Sarovar, you want to start?
Okay, I'll start with a little bit and then maybe I'll add a little bit later. But thanks, Rupali, and thank you all three of you. Very lovely presentations, fantastic drawings. Totally enjoyed it. All of you can become graphic novelists also. And I think all architecture students should consider different kinds of professions, because you do observe so interestingly in so much detail and draw it out. Sorry, names. I'm sorry, one second. For the first presentation, the two things that came to my mind was it was really interesting, your presentation, and also the detailing was fantastic. Priyanshi, what would be very interesting is to also think of it through certain kinds of fictions, because I'm just bringing in another handle. Like, there's that famous book, Tales of Firosha Bagh by Rohinton Mistry, but it's a very male-centric chawl experience book, and you create a very lovely and very different experience of the chawl through the feminine spaces. Just one caution though on the word gossip, because that's when women gather together, the assumption is gossip, and when men gather together, what are they doing? So I'm just being a little bit of a feminist here, and I think you're really onto something which has very good detail. What will also, for both Priyanshi and Forum, the book that comes to my mind, other book that comes to my mind is Bachelard. I don't know, I think one of you did mention it, the Poetics of Space, because that one of the exercises that I usually make students do is just do an ethnography of the drawer or the cupboard. And I think Forum mentioned this idea of intimate spaces and layers of intimacy that one builds, not just vis-a-vis the self, but through objects and things and cupboards and corners of cupboards, and the mother's cupboard, which is sometimes seen as this place where you can't reach, and it has so many different smells, and maybe a space for new bed sheets or a sari gift that will eventually, which has been lying there for years and will one day be pulled out and given to someone. And so it's when you're growing up, you have a sense of magic towards certain spaces. And I think that's something that is built very interestingly through thinking of the use of space by women. And of course, for Forum, as there's this one thing that I thought, you both did use this idea of the in-between space. What will be also very interesting is to actually articulate the in-between as the actual. क्योंकि वो margins का game I understand, लेकिन वो थोड़ा claim भी करना पड़ेगा अब. And वो कभी-कभी बहुत claim होता है. Women can be very territorially think about their things and how the house is arranged, and like there's certain thing. So see if instead of see if we are marginalizing them, if they are marginalized, and of course there is marginalization of the female. And I think in the third presentation, one second, hold on. I'm sorry, I'm moving. I'm like my sequencing of presentations is messed in my head. So there'll be certain things that apply to all. So this in between का जो game है उसको claim कैसे करेंगे? वो claim to space भी है. और वो adjusting है, वो उसमें बहुत वो है, उसमें like what Rupali was saying, malleable architecture. So to think of malleable architecture is real. It's the same thing that I'm saying. And malleable architecture is actually what a lot of people end up designing when they work on Bombay houses, because this, ek wing khol diya, sham ko ek band ho gaya. All these things will be very interesting to think of in their actual presence rather than as margins. And in one presentation, where you talked about single women, I have a proposition or a provocation to that, is to think of the single woman as queer. And this is slightly turning the queer discourse forward, back, or maybe taking it backward to its feminist roots, where the single woman is always treated as queer, where she is not hinged onto certain kinds of social frames or institutions or families, and so how do we start thinking of singleness as nearly as a form of queerness, or as it is viewed, especially for the feminine? When boys live alone, it's very different. The gaze on the single woman is way higher. The kind of regulation, the sense of control, the realms of control, presencing in the social, are all very differently calibrated. So that is one thing on your presentation, which was, I think, the second one. But yeah, Forum, fantastic images. I think you did the women in the toilet thing, really nice ones. And even for that image is it's really stayed with me, with that girl sitting and smoking. This is something I had originally put in that essay that I wrote on homing, that women, so a friend of mine came to my house and he said, "Oh, can I go smoke in the balcony?" And I said, "No, are you crazy? Like, I live alone here. You can't smoke in the balcony." And how men smoke outside and women always smoke in hidden spaces. So there's a 10 binary of, he's like, "Oh, मैं तो हमेशा balcony में cigarette पीता हूँ." I said, "हाँ, because," and in fact, what is really strange for me is that I can actually smoke in this room. And I was sitting in the morning in the balcony and I could see an uncle smoking in his balcony across. But I cannot imagine doing that because it's so much public view. So this, and it becomes a part of your system in some ways. So also about how these binaries are kind of playing against each other, it'll be interesting to look at. Yeah, that's mine.
Kush, you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Rupali. Thank you, Priyanshi, Gargi, and Forum, thanks again. Just thoroughly enjoyed your inquiries, your presentations, your narratives, and the deep sense of self that was part of those stories. Where do I start? I mean, it's just so much to absorb because in the span of those 10 minutes, you literally walked us through several ways in which bodies are not just claiming space, but bodies are able to become their fuller selves. I think that is the strength of your narratives. How the becoming of fuller selves is part of this project. As much as we try and say what is the construction of space, here is the construction of self. So self is also in the making, but then the fullness of self, as it is being expressed, as it is being claimed, as it is being adjusted in relation to other bodies. I think that was a kind of a common thread and an extremely strong one, uniting all three presentations. Let me go one by one and then probably sort of come back to common questions as well. So Priyanshi, you started with this question of the gaze, right? In a chawl setup, this idea of a gaze being making you very uncomfortable, and that's the starting point. And then you sort of move out from there, and then you move us through the various intimate, tiny spaces within the context of the chawl, but also immediate spaces outside it. And I couldn't help but think that, could the question have started with, but what is a gaze in the context of a chawl, as opposed to starting with that there is a gaze, which is making me uncomfortable. And so if you started with this question of what is a gaze, what it would allow you to do is when, right now, what happens is that gaze is equated to discomfort. But when do bodies begin to enjoy gaze? And this is where I'm sort of challenging the very heteronormative constructions. And sometimes what are the amorous ways in which bodies are even wanting to gaze and gaze at other bodies? And what are the ways in which, whether it's a woman's body or a queer body, is able to sort of play this game, right? In a very public setting, you still want to be seen and see somebody, but then it's a different dynamic, which still affords a realm of privacy. So I was, as much as you were so brilliant, and I remember there were drawings where even, a part of the window was closed and the woman was sitting below the sill level of the window on the floor by the kitchen as a way to sort of literally carve out a sense of privacy. So I was noticing how nuanced and how wonderfully observant and careful you were in your drawing making as well. But then I was thinking that, could there be moments, or have there been moments, or have you found in your own research ways in which sometimes the very sort of closing of one window, but the fact that the other shutter is open allows you to then secretly peep out and look at somebody else who you may have a fancy for? And so then what are those amorous ways in which you're still able to retain privacy, but then claim, again, become fuller self of who you are and your sexuality? Because we're talking about gender, but we're not talking enough about sexuality in that story. Gargi, brilliant. I mean, you know, such detailed ways in which you walked us through 3 cities, right? So Varanasi, sorry, you started with in UP, right? You started in UP and then moved to Goa and then Varanasi and then Bombay, right? So that was the whole trajectory. And you know, again, you know, kudos to you sort of feeling every bit of that. What does it mean to then move and then feel a sense of liberation? But I think that there's a danger here in simplistic sort of assumptions that Bombay being the most liberated of the cities and Varanasi being the most quote unquote conservative. So there's a danger here. As much as you're providing a much more liberated sense of awareness and logic to inhabitation, we tend to reproduce the conventions and assumptions that we're fighting against. So when I hear terms like in Goa, tomboy is ascribed a positive value. But in Varanasi, weirdo is ascribed a negative value. So even the idea of tomboy is it's a male construction. And how is it that a tomboy, or the idea of the masculine with the feminine, is valued over the feminization of the male body? So I think because it was such a detailed ethnographic work, I would encourage you to go back to your narrative, and every time we sort of fall in these traps, these very heteronormative patriarchal traps of what we understand a body doing and how we understand cities enabling our bodies to do that, challenge that, because that would really open up possibilities of how even possibly in a city like Varanasi with its compactness and kind of proximity, one is able to possibly live a kind of a liberated moment. And it's interesting, Gargi, that your project was called Selfing in the City, right? And I was waiting for instances where selfies become a way in which women are able to sort of access the digital media to then create networks and connections that are otherwise not afforded by the immediate space. So the idea of selfing in the city and selfies, Ayana Datta's work is brilliant. I'll share a link very soon. But Ayana Datta with Padmini Remare, they have done this very rich, again, digital ethnographic work of how in cities, in particularly in smaller cities, selfies in the smartphones become channels and medium through which to create new constructions of space and being. And then Forum, again, stories of domesticity and the various house forms, right? So when you started initially that you're going to look at chawl, you're going to look at bungalow, and you're going to look, I was like, my gosh, I mean, each one of them is a project in and of itself because they are massive types. And so I wanted to ask you as to why did you choose to, what was the thread connecting your choice of those house form types, and why you chose to not limit to a particular type and its variations versus provide a full gamut? So that's a question that possibly you could answer as well. But still, I think when you concluded, I think it became very clear of how groups of women or individually are able to sort of move past this binary of interiority and exteriority, right? So typically, if the place in a patriarchal setup, if the place of a woman is in the kitchen, the fact that when two men walk in, the women are out. And so it's an interesting inversion of how the exterior spaces then become the space for women to gather, as you rightly demonstrate. And again, the preserve of the home is still kind of male-centered. So in some ways, I don't know the extent to which it is really dismantling patriarchy. On the contrary, it's making visible. It's on the contrary, it's deepening how patriarchy is playing out. But ultimately, even your relationship to a space, whether it's inside the house or outside, is determined by your association with the man of the house. So I think that conclusion would be great, because then you would start saying that as much as we may want to think about women's bodies or non-binaries or queer bodies to take up certain space, there are certain limits to it, because the referent is always the patriarchal referent of the cis male. And so think through that segregated logic and ways in which it is playing out in your project. And one quick last comment before we sort of I have Prasad take over, but this idea of heteronormative constructions, right? That all of your familial constructions were very heteronormative. And which is why I think I was looking for possibilities of either kind of, I know Sarovar mentioned the queering of the gaze or the queering of the body, and I was just thinking of ways in which there is a possibility, given the fact that your social spectrum was so wide. It was not just young women or women of a certain age bracket, but it was kind of spanning a full spectrum. I was thinking of ways in which those homosocialities that you were trying to demonstrate of different bodies coming together to occupy and commingle are also opening up possibilities for queer bodies to layer themselves and find themselves, and then begin to sort of create more openings within this patriarchal system called the home. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just an invitation to sort of stretch it even further and think of, are these openings only for women, or openings in relation to men, or openings for lives that are lived outside frames of everyday reference to begin to become fuller versions of themselves? So that's a question for all three of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Kush. Prasad, do you want to come in?
I mean, I kind of felt so. They kind of started with the idea of the gaze and the problem with the gaze, and but a lot of the terms that you kind of use are about porosity, right? And I sort of thought that a lot of the drawings were actually about what happens in the opaqueness, right? In the secret space and in the hidings and in this, what you call the in-between spaces and in the nooks and the corners, right? What does opaqueness allow for, right? And what is the architecture that sort of, architecture space that is actually getting created in this opaque space, right? Space that is not immediately visible, right? Which is where the problem of the gaze kind of comes in. The second thing I kind of thought across all the three presentations was, to me, again, I think we've been speaking about this since the morning, is that a lot of the names and the types and the terms that you use for spaces are, kitchens and toilets and nooks and corners and, but the way I was actually looking at the drawings and, great diagrams and drawings was a creation of a space out of nothing, right? A toilet is not a toilet anymore. There's something else that is being actually made out of it, right? A cupboard is being made into something else altogether, a kitchen or a corridor, or, a space is being created out of nothing, right? Something that has no habitable space is being made habitable. So what is the architecture of this space that is getting created, right? In this opaque sort of a context, right? Rather than porosity and malleability, I kind of thought that there's a space getting created out of nowhere in a context of opaqueness, right? In all the three presentations in some ways. So, it's not about the in-between space or the leftover space. And I think, that there's this idea of the threshold, which again comes in the morning. The threshold is actually, the in-between space is actually getting created into a space, right? The toilet is actually getting sort of enlarged and sort of, extended and made into something that it is not. Right? There's a certain virtual process of, creating something new out of it, which it is not. And what is that new thing? What is the architecture of it? What is the architectural characteristics of the space, right? Because the way you say it is that the toilet becomes a place for something, but what is the architectural characteristics of the space, right? If I was to ask you to describe it in real detail, what does the toilet become, or what does the threshold become, or the corridor, or what is the detailed characteristics of this space that is not there, right? It's being created. It might disappear, but it's being created constantly, right? When no one is looking, right? Out of nothing, right? And that is what I felt was the interesting, is this new sort of spaces are being created out of nothing, which don't yet exist, but there is still an architectural characteristic and a thick nature to it, which I feel you need to start detailing out and giving it a name, right? Like, why call it a courtyard or a corridor, or, in between a corner? Like, think of what these kind of spaces are. And that I felt was, Gargi, I was looking at your diagrams, and the way you kind of draw out the diagram where this constant sense of, not so much about the freedom, but constant sense of, I think you use the word as, constantly wanting to detach oneself, right? If constantly wanting to detach oneself from the, not just common spaces and public spaces, but also the kind of identities one is assigned in these kind of spaces, right? So what is this, architecture of detachment, right? What is it, which I haven't seen yet, right? Because it's sort of an interesting stories and constantly stories of sort of detaching oneself from given names and identities, gaze. But then what does it look in terms of as an architectural characteristic, right? What is the architecture of this detachment? What are the mechanics of it? What does it look like in a little more detailed and there was yeah, I mean, I kind of felt that there is, in the drawings, there is an abundance of details, right? In the drawings, because the drawings are so beautiful, right? There's so much in the drawings that there's an abundance of space, right? There's actually so much going on in the drawings, but the way in which you describe it or call it is, you sort of give it a very name that is already there, which is a toilet, right? And you sort of call it a space for smoking, but there is so much more going on there. And if there's a possibility of, describing it in detail, detailing out the architecture of that kind of space, that is this abundance of space that gets created out of nothing, right? In this opaqueness and this hiding and this secrecy, right? And to give it a new kind of an architectural form through an architecture project, that would be very interesting. Okay, I'll stop here. And so for me, it wasn't so much about the claiming as much as it was about the creating, right? The claiming was there, but it was more of a creation of something that is not there, right? It's not a kitchen anymore. It's becoming something new, right? It's sort of altering the space into something else. So there's a creation rather than a simple claiming, right? So what is this, what does domesticity become into, right? And that is where I felt like the selfing, right, which is what this panel is about, is now more about a certain sense of, talking about a world, right? It's creating a world in the process of selling. It's creating a sort of a worldly sort of a space out of nothing in this process of selfing, right? So how do you, and as an architectural form, it's an interesting investigation to take up. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, all three of you. I think, I mean, it'll be nice if you all come and respond, just to kind of point to some of the things that Sarovar and Prasad sort of, brought in this idea of, in some ways, rethinking some of the categories through which we think, like this whole idea of, when Sarovar said in between spaces, can we kind of not call them in between spaces, but they become mainstream in some ways, right? Like, so you don't, this idea that in some ways you continue to marginalize some of these spaces, but you kind of look at them as recentering, you recenter them. And Prasad is saying, can there be another, like you have, all of you have brought in a different kind of taxonomy of spaces that women kind of construct for themselves, but can there be another naming, another kind of nomenclature to these spaces, so that we start thinking of them through their thicknesses, that in some ways, challenges some of the ways in which we understand space otherwise. And Kush actually brings in another sort of provocation where he says, can you push these ideas of identity that you have started to, unpack in starting to look at, other ideas of queering, and, when you talk about this idea of gendering, is it kind of outside sexuality, for example, and that actually kind of also brings us to how we deal with the field, because in some ways, all of these, and that's the strength of the thesis also, that it comes from, deep observations of the field. And I think that is also something that we kind of spoke about in the, probably on the first day, where, the idea of the carnival was being discussed. How do you enter as people in a field with certain sort of, your own biases, and also, interviewers who are also kind of coming in with things that they are, cards that they are holding onto their chests, and, not sort of presenting things, out to you. What does it mean to kind of, open up? How do you kind of not become interviewer, interviewee, but, in some ways open up ideas of friendships and, trust, and which is where because there are many things that we don't want to say, and we want to hide because there's a kind of normative which is very, very strong and dominant out there. And that dominant trope also constructs our architectures, but in all of your stories, we know that doesn't exist. There's a kind of reclaiming that is happening in many ways. So how do you kind of push those questions, and kind of reclaim, some of the spaces that are beyond the dominant much, much more? So maybe if you can come, I don't know if you can speak about your own experiences on the field, and where did you find resistance, and where how did you actually approach it? Might be interesting to begin as a response, in all three cases.
Yeah. So about rethinking and creating new spaces. So all the cases which were there were kind of creating these temporary spaces. So these were they were creating new spaces at some point, but then it disappears at some point. So uh, uh, even if there is this whole so the creating of new space for me was only for a little time, where answering Kush's question about what is gaze for me. So my experience about myself only. So depending on the objects also, how much it closes, how much it opens. So if the window is open a little, for me that time the gaze is more than when the window is fully open. So that time the position of the body and the way I behave, everything changes. So all of this is for a temporary period of time, and then it comes back to normal when everything is closed. So it's just for a few time, and then it disappears. Um, yeah.
Uh, so first thing, answering to Kush's question about why did I choose the the typologies or 4 different typologies. So initially, our research had started like way before when there was lockdown. So I never actually physically visited the homes in the entire period. The cases were decided on the basis of my prior visits to the houses in my own networks, and the interviews were conducted on phone calls, sometimes on video calls, or at cases when women, they were performing some specific chores, they would take me around the house. So and they were not just conducted once. Like if I had something, sometimes they're conducted multiple times. So uh, I they were conducted according to my own networks, and so I decided to take 4 different approaches from my own friends, relatives, neighbors, or friends of friends. So that is why. But what happened eventually is after when I conducted these interviews, the conclusion was that even though there were 4 different typologies, the behaviors were similar. So that, and what so Um, yeah, I'll formulate it and answer it some other after a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You
So yeah, I'll respond to Kush where he mentioned that why being a tomboy, like it was taken as a negative comment when in Varanasi, but when sorry when, was taken positively when the interviewee was in Goa, and then being called a weirdo was taken as a negative comment. So I had a similar question, and I asked my interviewee about this. So she said that she identifies herself as a tomboy, not because she actually relates to the feet but she proclaims herself as tomboy only because it is easy to for people living. So I'm sorry. So she proclaimed herself as tomboy, not necessarily because it was term that she personally felt identified with, but rather because these the term was easy to explain to the people when she was living in Goa. So the people they took it open mindedly, and it was easier to convince them that why she was not girly enough. Because but when in Varanasi, when it was they did not take it like they could not really accept the terms because it was difficult to accept that, because it was not fitting the gender norms, and hence it was difficult for them to accept the term. So they took it in a negative way and not positively. But when in Goa, it was easier for her to identify with the word. And I'm sorry, and in response to Prasad, the architecture of detachment. So I'm yet to articulate that, but from the stories that I collected, I could identify that they never really felt uh, home when they were living in their temporary houses, because they were just moving from one place to another, and all these houses they felt like they felt temporary to them. But they in the end each one of them all said that they will only feel home when they have a personal a property of their own, because then they'll have a sense of belonging. So yes. And the architecture of detachment, I'm yet to formulate, and I'll look into that.
Uh, Also, one more thing. Sorry, Rupali was saying something.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, just so when Prasad said that it was more about creating of space rather than claiming of space. So what I thought is that it women they did create their own space, but in the process of creating their own space, they were claiming space in a way, and those were and these were they were claiming spaces or by performing acts of resistance, and those were subtle transgressions which happened, and so they're both very interrelated also.
Absolutely. I think, I mean, that's quite clear that they are claiming spaces. But in some ways, I think that's what both Prasad and Sarovar are trying to tell you is if you kind of, push that idea of claiming, where you kind of think of them as not marginalized spaces, but we think through those as kind of, bringing the centrality back into them, then what would it mean? For a design process, that they don't continue being marginalized, but they become the kind of spaces through which we think, and that might kind of allow us to completely rethink this idea of standardized spaces that we otherwise kind of imagine. So I think that's a useful trope to think through as designers. But I just wanted to maybe talk about little bit about the field, because I think what is nice is that all of you are, I mean, these are such intimate stories and experiences, and you're able to draw them out in that sense. So if you want to talk, and I know this is COVID times, and a lot of these were kind of phone interviews and all of that, and I know that Forum has also kind of written some of these as semi-fictional stories, because she didn't want the identities of some of the people to be revealed in some ways, so in some ways that became also a method to draw and to kind of write those stories, and also kind of maybe conjoining a lot of those experiences together, because these were patterns that she finds. So these are not individual stories, but they are in some ways collective stories, right? But do you want to talk a little bit about your field engagement and how you kind of went about the studies? And what is the resistance in that?
Forum, you want to go? Yeah, so during the field study, one thing which I noticed, so I think I went twice or thrice. So the first time I went, they were not at all comfortable, like, because I was not prepared with my questions and how should I ask them about the intimate spaces, the private spaces, which so and even in the day and the COVID time, even men were around. So they told me that you don't come at this time, you can't ask these questions when they are around. Uh, and so so I didn't know what to do, so I went back. Then again, the second day when I came back, they took me to one smaller room, and that time they were opening up, and that time I didn't ask them like direct questions and a full formulated question. It was a casual conversation, because that time they opened up very well. And yeah, so I think in most of the cases, 2-3 times it happened, and then I realized like uh, so I had to go at particular that time only, when they used to tell me that this time he's not there, so you come at this time, and then I'll tell you, I'll open up more.
Any guardian?
I like to add one more thing. So when I started interviewing these women, so initially I made a set of questionnaire, like I prepared a questionnaire for them, and I started directly asking them those questions. But I realized that it wasn't really helping me to identify my concern. So what are the main aim was not being uh, articulated through those questionnaires, but it could only be possible when I actually started I started with sharing my own experiences, and I shared my concern with them, and that is when they could resonate with me, and that is when they started opening up even more. So that helped me in my stories, because then the conversation got more intimate, and they got comfortable with me once they started resonating. So yeah.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to kind of say anything about the presentations? The audience, students?
In fact, I was just thinking, and that point was kind of made by Sarovar passingly. I mean, I was a bit disturbed by, that this normalizing tendency of the woman occupying the marginal space. And because this is something that also I don't know if it has been accrued socially, or we, like, what do we want to say when we say that, because I mean we know that Simone de Beauvoir would say that how the woman is always guarding her body because of the identification of the subconscious lack of the organ. Or even Iris Marion Young, when she writes about Throwing Like a Girl, where she's kind of doing empirical research on how the woman is not able to open her body up completely. So in that sense, I don't know if it is a social kind of condition that gets played out in the space around, or it is actually so. And I mean, I was just disturbed by the three presentations in that way. I mean, of course, the presentations were very rich and very beautifully illustrated, and it was. And sometimes the paternal gaze is also internalized, no, in a lot of subjects. So the researcher, I don't know how the researcher can disentangle that, and of course it requires much more in-depth kind of engagement with the subjects, but this was something that I was wanting to kind of share, that is it really. And yeah, the fact that Sarovars kind of said it, that be careful, is what
No, yeah. I mean, I don't know if I think it's not about really sort of one versus the other. I mean, this is kind of their deep the field engagements, and you're seeing that people are in some ways claiming in many ways. So what you see from the outside as disturbing, when you go closer, you find that there are ways in which negotiations happen and all kinds of things happen. What does it mean to kind of think of them through as more sort of decent, as kind of really sort of centered, and how do you kind of push that claiming, that sense of claiming through the affordances and other things. But I think what is, and this is where I want to also come back to kind of the primacy of the field, that in some ways many times the like field engagement also kind of helps us to rethink some of the categories through which we enter. What kind of makes us uncomfortable, because often our discomfort comes also from our own sort of frames and categories and all of that, and the field actually displaces some of that. It kind of displaces that for us as researchers also, because if that it doesn't displace us as researchers, then there's a problem. Then you've already gone with a kind of a frame through which you want to see and say, okay, now this is, I'm already disturbed, I'm still disturbed. But the field actually tells us many more things which are much more fluid, and much more allows us to destabilize some of our own sort of biases through which we enter. So I think that it's really sort of important to think through that, and which is why maybe bringing in new terms to think of, or new conceptual frames to kind of think of the field, is also important, and which is what also came up in the discussion here. So
I want to, Rupali, on this thing of the field, and because we're talking about somewhere gendered field, access to women's space.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done a lot of field work related to my work in anthropology and architecture, or whatever you want to call my discipline now. But so I was thinking of the fact that how, as women researchers, we have a lot more access to women's spaces, and that happens. And of course there are layers of the encounter, like you all experienced, that you went. And I think Priyanshi was saying that didn't have a structured interview. Sometimes actually it's in anthropology we literally learn this, that it's outside the structure where you learn the other stuff. तीनों नॉट कर रही हैं. So वो जो तुमने वाला पहला वाला शीट बनाया ना तुम्हारा, उसको थोड़ा सा हिलाना पड़ता है फिर. तो वो एक तो ये चीज हमें पता है, लेकिन दूसरा इसका फॉल आउट क्या होता है कि, and this is related to another point that I was saying earlier about the woman in the field. So like when I used to first do field work in Dongri during Muharram days, I used to dress in black, and I also for some reason decided to wear an abaya, because you learn in fieldwork that you have to fold into the field in some ways.
What is an abaya?
Like just a headscarf, okay, a black headscarf. And oh my God, I was only thrown into women's spaces, and I was not doing my fieldwork on women's spaces. Okay. Then what happens, and I'm giving this to you as a interesting tension of the female body, and everybody was like, अच्छा हाँ वो women's area में आप चली जाइए. हाँ, they knew I'm an outsider because मेरी चाल ढाल ऐसी है थोड़ी. लेकिन and you will be known as an outsider in many places, and you can fold in suddenly and then fold out of these things. But what happened was I was like, I want to know what's going on in the men's space, you know, because Muharram is like a very it's street fest, right? And I was like, what do I do? Yaar, main abaya pehen ke aati hu. Everybody makes me sit in these women's spaces. So the next year, when I went for fieldwork, I wore black clothes out of respect for the fact that there is a ritual, religious, whatever. I'm not wearing bright clothes or anything. But instead of an abaya, I put a camera around my neck. And the men's spaces opened like this. All the men wanted to talk to me because suddenly there was a very unspoken notion that I'm an outsider who's come to understand that world. So here one side I was trying to fold, and it's very complicated. Fieldwork का formula नहीं हो सकता कोई. हाँ, you kind of figure out these permutation combinations yourself. And when you do fieldwork, and the world is a male space, okay, and you will work function. So there's, you know, there are many conversations going on in ideas of fieldwork. Fieldwork की history एक तरह से वो है, you know, the colonial auditors going and measuring land or doing anthropological surveys. वो lone man Indiana Jones जा रहा है, ठीक है, वो सब अब बदलने की कोशिश है. So I have actually had times where I have a friend who does fieldwork on weekly markets, and she's a kind of a introvert, and she'll not go and talk and haggle with the shopkeepers like I'm like a slightly extrovert person, as you may have noticed. uh, so she would say, acha, I'm going to this hafta bazaar, you want to come? And I'll be like, ha, I'll come. And for me, I was just like bazaring. Okay, I was like, bhaiya, ye earrings kitne ke hain? Ye to diamond lag raha hai, lekin ye hai, matlab, you know, all these. And then so why is it that fieldwork is this isolated solo male act? एक तो वो भी हमें क्वेश्चन करना है, फिर उसके अलग अलग कॉम्बिनेशंस जो बनते हैं वो हमें देखने हैं, उसको हम how somewhere in your field work, see now after I don't know how 10 years of doing different kinds of field work, I can say these things. But there is actually very little articulation of the nuances of fieldwork, which Rupali is also pointing out, right? The ways that women's spaces will open for you, the ways sometimes they will limit you. Why can't I do my fieldwork at what I call quote unquote londa zone of like a chai shop, you know, जहाँ सारे लड़के सिगरेट पी रहे हैं ऐसे खड़े होके, उसमें मैं क्यों नहीं जा सकती हूँ उस स्पेस में? उसको एंटर करने के लिए मुझे क्या करना पड़ेगा? मुझे अपनी फेमिनिटी को क्या करना पड़ेगा? और फिर मैं पब्लिक स्ट्रीट स्पेस मेल स्पेस उस पर कैसे काम करूंगी? और वो कंटेस्टेशन ऑफ द फीमेल बॉडी बहुत स्ट्रॉन्ग है. That's why I was talking about the idea as the female body as queer. And women who go and work outside, who do certain things, are constantly negotiating different kinds of, you know, relationship to the body in the public space. And as researchers, you will do the same.
Yeah, I mean, just also in some ways, I think it's important. I mean, just to kind of go ahead with that, is that it's important to reverse that kind of anthropological gaze oneself, you know, because in some ways things surprise us. You know, you go in with a frame and you have to allow yourself to be surprised.
Right,
You know, because otherwise then there's no point, you know, then there's no point of doing the research, because you've gone with that kind of box and you've come back with that box. So in that sense, kind of let going of oneself is
there is always slippage in fieldwork, always. फिर तुम खींच रहे होते हो उसको अपने डब्बों में कि यार इसको कैसे फिट करूं, वो स्लिपेज को ध्यान रखना.
Absolutely. Anybody else wants to come in here? Prasad.
Just, I mean, does the form and does the space, like for example, Priyanshi's chawl or this one's house, Forum's house, or iska rented accommodation where there is a certain density and then of the neighborhood, does that have to do with the kind of questions that they're also asking, in the sense that yesterday Asmita spoke about government housing, and Ashwin spoke about his own house and a joint family where he was kind of, constrained, and he was kind of, talking of so many negotiations. Does the spatial configuration, the densities, the sizes, the class, and all other dimensions, does it kind of uh, have impact on
on the spatiality, on the experience. Of course it has, but these particular ones which are like the focusing on the interstitials, as everybody is focusing on the interstitial, uh, and the other spaces, no? So does it have to do with also the is the experience in the, because like I can understand the chawl for uh, chawl is a tricky, like the chawl is a very the density and the configuration and the form, it's the inhabitation is complex and complicated actually. You know, it's like it's and negotiations happen at a variety of levels actually. And what and Priyanshi's whole thing that, you know, the you kind of constantly are in a process of creating uh, uh, isolating and creating space for yourself constantly. Every moment is you are kind of, you know, uh, carving out space, and you do it with everything, whatever material available and everything available. uh, does the conflict, like yesterday Asmita when she spoke, she did not speak anything, did not touch it actually, और उससे पहले Asmita very spoke about the home and the house and stuff, but she did not touch it at all actually. Like and who else spoke yesterday? Day before yesterday, and the others were kind of not connected. But Asmita particularly. Asmita is there. Asmita, are you around? Do you are able to understand my question? The whole idea, the are you able to like the experiences of forum? Gargi is talking of the way things get absorbed, or Priyanshi particularly. Do you experience anything like that? That similar thing one can see it with Ashwin's kind of, you know, complex family, you know. But in your case, what is the kind of this experience of gender? What is the how is the
I
nature?
think so. There is. I hope you all are able to hear me. Yeah. So there is actually a difference in the batch that is coming, that is being employed right now. So the difference is that the new batch that has come in, uh, they are more bachelors, people who are staying away from the families. More transfers are happening because the lower grade has been completely omitted from the office, because there are more graduates and more scholarly people, so to say, that are passing out from the academies. And the older households which have joint families, which have been working for generations. Earlier, in government organizations, you could get a job if you're a son, or the elder son or daughter of the employee. So those generations, some of those generations are there. So these are the two broad categories. So right now, the major batch is the one who are the newer ones, who are people who are on transfer. And somewhere I think I was looking at both of them, but to an extent I was looking at that batch, because that change is happening right now. There are more people retiring and new people coming in, and that cycle is still going on. So what is happening? One thing is the family is away from the joint family, from their extended family. So the nuclear family that is migrating, they, even though they are from a conservative background, the family in presence of whom they feel that they have to behave in a certain manner, that is not there. That space is not there because they are away. So that's why both men and women, they are, kind of equally free to do whatever they want to do, so to say. And also the new the new batch that is coming in, both men and women are equally working in different places. It's mostly the batch that I have in this colony specifically is mostly north, and they're all working in government. So the nature of how they share the space or how they behave is not very different. It's equal for men and women because of the nature of
you feel the equality. Is Komal around? Komal, are you there?
I'm here, Prasad. I'm right.
Komal, you want to talk about your the note that you sent me just some time ago? The way I'm getting this because the question of there's an expanded possibility of looking at space and form, over here. The way one kind of looks at things, the kind of detail one focuses on, etc. Komal, you want to kind of talk about when the cooperative housing society is taken over by women, then what are the areas that they focus on?
I mean, so I was just telling Prasad this afternoon, my mom was telling me yesterday evening that in our cooperative housing society in Nagpur, the men have sort of given all office and the entire charge to suddenly the women of the society. And it all actually happened very organically because, for instance, there is the new secretary. She's a lady who recently lost her husband, and because she has a ground floor flat, she's constantly sort of, the eyes in the society. She's sort of organically looking at, sort of managing attendance for the guards and, sort of making sure that the gate is cleaned up and, stuff like that. So she's organically sort of, now engaging with talking to them and, taking care of them and also sort of maintaining attendance records and everything. Similarly, for instance, there's another lady who sort of manages whose husband is the treasurer, but she is the one who's at home because at the time when transactions happen, when salaries have to be paid, when maintenance have to be collected during the day, the man of the house is not at home. It's the woman who's sort of there, and she sort of keeps all the hisab in that sense. Similarly, there's a newly appointed the president, who is actually, because of her profession as a doctor, she is sort of, there is this lens of looking at a very responsible, of course, these are families that have stayed together for 35-40 years in the same cooperative housing society and have known each other as sort of women and as people. But it was very interesting to see how sort of, because the men have no time they hold office, but they have no time to engage with it. And when the women sort of offered to take it up, they were very happy to sort of transfer charge. And
I think the focal length question, the optic and the focal length question as to how does your focal length shift based on what you are and where you stand actually. And I think those and that is also clear in Priyanshi and this one's forum's drawings also. Where do you see from actually? And then Prasad mentioned there are so much detail that I'm seeing, and you're not talking about it. She's not talking about it because you're seeing it actually. It doesn't like it's there on the screen actually. So it's a. I think that those many ways to kind of enter the dynamics of space, the way one sees it, the way one occupies it, and the way one inhabits it, like the whole things. I think that will be useful for you all to kind of because like Anuj is kind of discomforted. I can agree, I understand, but it discomforts, I think, all of us also. The whole the realm of what is one kind of talking and pushing and constantly kind of speaking about actually. Like there is the framework of there are definite frameworks one is kind of seeing, but the mechanics of it and the nuts and bolts of it, when you open, there is probably many more possibilities to kind of work from, which are fundamentally different from men, the way they experience the world, and I think that the question of how does one experience the world in nuts and bolts is a question that has to be taken very objectively and very generously. That's what I feel.
Forum wanted to say something.
Yeah, Prasad, when
Bolo.
Komal narrated the story, what I could look at is like my way of seeing was that they were able to take over things because it was a group of women and not one person alone. And so the idea that when women come together, even when I was speaking to them, I remember this very clearly that in the second year we had a field study in Kamatipura and we were 4 girls together.
Yeah.
And not once, like only, and me and Priyanshi were together during that time as well. And no, like for a second we thought, but then we knew that all of us were together. So we never got scared. Like I don't think, in fact, it was very interesting. And even when I was conducting the interviews, all the women, in fact, everyone, they were encouraging enough to come back, speak multiple times.
No, the differences are difference. The extremely hostile and problematic and discriminating and exploitative and segregatory dimensions of difference is definitely there. I mean, I'm not denying that. I'm saying what is fundamentally, what is, how does one kind of and people have spoken about this in length actually, the question of difference in this. I'm saying as what changes in spatial terms, in terms of experiences, in terms of is there any change of or because if you kind of place that uh, 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 then your uh, uh, projections and possibilities will also get constrained with that. Sorry, I'm just kind of Sarovar, you want to come?
And then we'll end.
I just have a very small thing to say, that it's my vote of thanks because I won't be there tomorrow. I have a 3 4. I told Rohit this. I had a 3-4 hour block teaching tomorrow. So
हम इतने भी तो बुरे नहीं हैं यार.
Oh my God, Prasad. No, it's like so fantastic for me. And I was telling Rupali earlier that I found photographs from 2017 with some of you. Ashi, I found a very nice picture of you in your blue dress presenting, and I found photo. I've literally seen like you guys are like growing up. Ashi doesn't seem to have aged, but Heron has definitely aged a little bit, thankfully. And so I found all these photos of all of you. So it's been really nice to see you guys also go through these different, journeys of sea, or by the sea, or in the sea of sea. And I'm sure you guys have lots of memes on this, the sea business. So thanks a lot, guys, and really lovely for the presentation. I was also telling my students about you guys and your work, and telling them they're quite useless in some ways, poor things. And so it's really inspiring, and I hope to see you maybe sometime in the future in analog. Okay. And maybe, yeah. And thanks, Rupali, Anuj, Rohit, Prasad, Dipti. Where is she gone? And Rohit has to do all
I'm
the
here.
And I'm a very slow person in coordinating with, because I'll reply after 4 days. So that was his tough luck. And thanks to Kush and Prasad P and Mr. Kashikar, who is not here, for being fellow companions in this. So thanks a lot, guys. And I will be here for the next 10 minutes. But as always, I have another meeting. I also have this fear. I saw this photograph of a man who died taking a Zoom class. So I keep telling my students that one day, you know, tum log bol rahe ho, ma'am, are you there? I would have died only. How much Zoom I've done. So from Zoom to Doom is my game. So chalo, let me be with you for another 10 minutes. But I just wanted to thank you guys. It was really nice, so stimulating. As you can see, I like you. It's difficult to shut me up, and you guys have like hyper stimulated me. Thank you.
Thanks, okay, let Kush go, and then we'll kind of do our vote of thanks.
Okay.
For you as well.
So thanks so much. Well, I know, yeah, I saw the schedule and kind of knew that you were not going to be joining us tomorrow, but a joy, what a joy to get to meet you and share this space. So we'll come back to all the word of thanks in a minute, but I just wanted to go back to this question of the field. Sorry to belabor this point a little bit, but I couldn't help but think about, I think one of you, was it Gargi or Forum, who mentioned Doreen Massey? Or was it Priyanshi? One of you, had Doreen Massey's framework. Forum, you, right? Yeah. And, Massey puts forward, this brilliant invocation of a field, not just as a spatial construct, but also an epistemological construct. And what that does is that it really then asks you to, as a researcher, then clarify both the conceptual frameworks with which you start, but also the conceptual frameworks with which you conclude. And this brings me back to the discomfort that Anuj was expressing in these drawings. I sometimes feel that architecture, we get kind of caught up in these negotiations and these thresholds, and everything has a positive valence to it. But I think if drawings can begin to exaggerate and really intensify and evoke a sense of discomfort, that should also be the work of architecture, enough to then begin to trouble us and then reposition us in the context of the field and the field that we are engaging as students, researchers, designers, what have you. So just wanted to say that discomfort is good, and drawings that make you uncomfortable, even better.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to kind of, just one more thing about, like, I totally agree that discomfort is good and it's important, and but it's also kind of important to think about our own sort of epistemological frameworks of where discomfort comes from and where it doesn't, because to understand that we also come from certain structures of knowledge, and it's important for the field to also maybe allow us to kind of destabilize some of that as well. So just to kind of, I totally agree that, but to also kind of place ourselves in that epistemological sort of framework is important. So, I mean, in some ways, I just kind of go back to some of the, like, for example, when we talk about gossip, can we think of gossip as kind of mainstream? If we think, instead of looking at gossip as something that is, relegated to the spaces of women, does gossip become kind of a new epistemological framework to think of knowledge through? Or for example, the last kind of presentation, we were talking about the idea of nomadic spaces, and how nomadic spaces kind of get formed through certain epistemologies. But I just want to, I mean, actually just kind of going back to this Ramchandra Guha's article on this anthropologist Velvin Elvin, who's sort of talking Verrier Elvin, who's kind of I mean, this whole sort of idea of savaging the civilized, of coming back and starting to look at a frame through which you kind of look at your own self as sort of problematized in some ways, and I think those new conceptual categories are very important for us to think of, and this is again where absolutely agree with you that these are epistemological categories through which we think, but it's also important to kind of allow ourselves to be sort of in some ways shaken a little bit by those categories that we kind of encounter.
Agreed, Rupali. I mean, it's my points were in alignment with it, which is why I thought the conclusions could return to the same kind of frameworks and what has changed and what has remained. Yeah,
absolutely.
And the frameworks, as we were discussing yesterday. अरे wait कर रही हूँ, मेरे को भी vote of thanks चाहिए. No, I was saying that as the frameworks you were discussing yesterday with Anuj, who was his winter of discontent with me about the inductive and the deductive frames. And
वो तेरी खींच रहा था.
And the
No, I didn't really.
abductive and the abductive.
he was like actually, grilling.
English के words है. अनुज, inductive, deductive, objective.
मुझे तो बहुत poetic लगा इसलिए मैंने पूछ लिया.
Oh God, you have to do the logic class to see how horrible inductive and deductive logic is. So anyways, it was, I think the frames are something that, I mean, I call it towards new epistemologies that students generate.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's very important. So thank you, everyone. It's 6:30. In Sarovar's language, we've already missed, how many trains we've missed already? 15 trains. So, but yeah, thank you everyone for this very rich discussion. It's gone on to like 30 minutes more than what it was planned for, but I think it's totally worth it because we've had some very interesting discussions here. And thank you, Sarovar, for being here for the last 3 days. We are going to totally miss you tomorrow and all the entertainment value that happens. sorry, that is main.
That's, by the way, part of my new epistemology of like giving public talks, because sense of humor has completely died thanks to grouchy men.
I totally agree.
It's like without thinking an eyelid, they give a speech. I mean, one side I'm trying to develop a personality which is like that, but it's in the process of making.
Absolutely. I mean, it's something I want to do that when I grow up. So thank you so much. No, I think this has been a really, really sort of interesting.
आ जाना बीच में.
हाँ,
I'll try because वो 3 घंटे का class के बाद I'll try.
हाँ यार, come tomorrow. Join us tomorrow after your
I'll
class.
tell my students to also join. Let's see.
Yeah.
हाँ, आ जाओ.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And bye.
Bye. See you.
The rest of you tomorrow, and hopefully Sarovar in this some pop-up mode on Zoom tomorrow.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks, Rupali. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.